we welcome you to this discussion today, which will explore this interesting relationship between, if there is one, between faith and reason. The theme of faith and reason is it's a hotly debated theme, even nowadays. But it, of course, goes back centuries. Thinkers, philosophers, theologians have explored this theme since, not time immemorial, because but since the very beginning of human thought. And one of the first questions that, of course, comes to mind when thinking of this particular relationship is, of course, is there a relationship between these two realities? Can they both give us knowledge? Right? I don't know if you're familiar with Anselm's thought, the idea of faith seeking understanding, the idea that both of them can actually give us knowledge of different things, but they both have a hold on reality. But is this so? Is this the case? Nowadays, philosophers and thinkers also speak sometimes of reason as being sometimes irrational, sometimes it being supra-rational. So the idea that sometimes perhaps faith is, if faith is irrational, then, can it bear knowledge? I suppose not. But if it's supra-rational, then perhaps, yes, it can bear knowledge, but of a different kind than reason can. I won't get into the questions and I won't try to answer them. That's something that I'll leave up to these two. But before we begin exploring it, let me first introduce you to them. So there's Reverend Christopher Caruana on the left. Father Christopher Caruana is a visiting, I don't need to actually, but yes, is a visiting lecturer in philosophy and theology at the University of Malta and the Sacred Heart Major Seminary in Gozo. After completing his undergraduate studies in Malta and Bologna, he further studied philosophy at the universities of Oxford, London, and the Catholic University of Lublin. His doctoral thesis was about the metaphysics of hylomorphism and the mind-body problem. He is a member of the Archdiocesan Doctrinal Commission. Now we go on to Professor Jean-Paul de Lucca. He's a member of the Department of Philosophy at the University of Malta, where he lectures on the history of philosophy and ideas, political thought, and the philosophy of law. He is the convener of the department's research seminar series and the coordinator of its MA in philosophy, politics, and society. He's a specialist on early modern philosophy and intellectual history, and he has held research fellowships at the University of Roma Tre, the Warburg Institute, and the Institute of Philosophy in Leuven. I'll leave it up to these two, and we'll hope to have a very interesting discussion. Meanwhile, I don't know what you think, but perhaps if anybody wants to add a comment or have a question, I don't know if they should feel free to do so. But we'll see how it goes. Okay.
Okay, where do we start? So, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. What triggered this conversation tonight was the 25th anniversary of the promulgation of Pope St. John Paul II's encyclical Fides et Ratio last September. It was a very interesting contribution within his pontificate, and it shows how keenly he felt the need for a stimulus in the intellectual debate and theological and philosophical research within the Catholic Church, and also to reclaim the contribution of the Church towards philosophy and theology, and also to see in the Church a valid student of both philosophy and theology. So that encyclical is still with us, and we're all encouraged to read it and to reread it, because it's almost a syllabus of themes for those who are interested in the topic of faith and reason. I will just give a brief overview of this encyclical so people who are not familiar with it might become so. There is no particular vision which is promoted by the encyclical, but it's more a stimulus, a narrative, and also a prophetic invitation to all Catholics to engage with the deep or the sapiential questions, the sapiential tradition of philosophy, that is, to answer the big questions, so to speak, And so the encyclical begins with an introduction reflecting on the Delphic oracle, which we could say was one of the genetic triggers of philosophy. Gnoti se auton, noscete ipsum, know yourself. And that is not a very innocent choice, knowing John Paul II's love for modern philosophy, the turn to the subject, subjectivity in researching introspectively for the truth. And he wants to connect what we do as Catholics, as Christians today, as theists, as believers, with that original question asked by the Greeks, to know yourself as the beginning of all wisdom. But there is also a clear preference for the primacy of revelation and of the faith. And so there is an uncompromising reverence towards the fact that human knowledge is limited, human reason is finite, and it must bow its head before the revelation of wisdom in the person of Christ. And so chapter 1 of the encyclical is precisely this, the wisdom of God unleashed in the mystery of the Incarnation. It's God who breaks into time and space with the gift of his Logos, the Son, the incarnate Word. And so, yes, if there is a balance, it's definitely in favor of the primacy of faith and the primacy of God's grace. That is, it's unequivocal throughout the encyclical. So chapter 1 is not in favor of Aquinas or Augustine or Bonaventure or Rana or Lonergan. It's a clear decision and a clear act of reverence and of humbling towards the sovereignty of the Logos of Christ, in the Word incarnate. But then chapters 2 and 3 show that human beings defined as truth seekers. The encyclical defines man as a truth seeker, a being who yearns for the truth and whose reason, whose rationality is oriented to the truth. That's a very controversial, and very bold assertion, but the encyclical makes it without any embarrassment throughout, that our rationality is by nature inclined, oriented, or if you like, programmed to search for the truth. And there are various avenues for this. Two stand out. So fides querens intellectum, faith, searching for understanding, or belief in order to understand, which is the Anselmian, Augustinian, Tertullian tradition, if you like, giving the first step to the faith. We cannot know truth on our own, and so we need the faith to enable us. Very many distinguished philosophers like Pascal as well will subscribe to this approach, that faith does not need reasons. It's not in search for warranted justification. Faith is a gift of grace. It's a God-given inclination we have, and we better do it right away. We better make this act of faith as soon as possible. So fides querens intellectum as the first step to prevent you from wasting time and energy in your life. Chapter 3 would be then the other avenue, complementary, which is intelligo ut credam, I understand for me in order to believe. So reason is not the enemy of the faith. On the contrary, reason is a natural God-given potential that we have for us to ask the right questions, to articulate the need for truth, and ultimately to discover God. Unlike philosophers like Tertullian, for instance, who would not accept that we can know God's existence through reason, John Paul II, like Aquinas, like Scotus, is an a posteriori realist, we say, that he would really have this optimistic reliance in the human intellect to know facts and to find in these facts evidence for God's existence. So, credo ut intelligam on one hand, intelligo ut credam on the other, they're both complementary avenues for us to discover God and to know the truth. The other chapters then examine the relationship between philosophy and theology, because there is a leap, from our natural instincts to a professional, then academic, systematic engagement with both. And the rest is a more explicitly Catholic discussion of theology and philosophy within the Church and within the Church's mission to guide, to teach as a mother, and to correct as well, to correct our ability to ask and to find answers. I'll stop there for now. Perhaps Professor De Lucca would want to connect.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to INST for organizing this, and thank you, Father Chris, for this really helpful overview of what really started off, what triggered this conversation, the encyclical Fides et Ratio. Of course, the discussion is not about the encyclical. It's just provided us with the occasion, I guess, to have this conversation about faith and reason. So it's not meant in any way as sort of a critical appreciation of the encyclical. But there are, of course, a number of points that Father Chris just mentioned that can open up the conversation that come out of that encyclical. First of all, one of the first points that was mentioned was that there's a very intentional point that is made that theology is not and should not be tied to any philosophical system, right? So, of course, we know that there are in the history of theology certain movements, certain traditions, certain philosophical traditions, certain authors that, for a variety of reasons, have been privileged, right? But I think it was important, it's an important point that is made, that one should avoid, right, a dogmatic approach, right? A dogmatic approach to philosophy. In fact, there's a point in the encyclical, which is a broader point, really, that one has to distinguish, and this I think is a very important point, that one has to distinguish between a philosophical system, whichever that is, right, and philosophical inquiry. And that philosophical inquiry should always be privileged over a philosophical system. In other words, whether it's within Christian theology, I'm not sure whether one should speak of Christian philosophy. I'd rather use it in inverted commas. That it is not a commitment to a methodological approach, to a view in particular, but the ultimate commitment is to that philosophical inquiry, the encyclical calls it, which ties in with the idea of this definition, if you like, of the human being as a truth seeker. One could also perhaps place the encyclical, which was promulgated in 1998, within its, now with hindsight 25 years, we can clearly see its historical context, right? Of course, it was very well known at the time, but the encyclical was written to try and open up and rethink this relation between, on the one hand, faith and reason, philosophy and theology as disciplines. I'll come back to this perhaps in a bit. At a time where, and this is said very explicitly, perhaps sometimes a bit too crudely, if you ask me, in the encyclical, that what was seen as an onslaught on the very idea of the truth, right? And it's not religious truth; it's not truth in terms of God necessarily, even though there were ramifications and implications, but of the very idea that there's no such thing as the truth. Okay, there's no such thing as that human reason can have access to, right? In its different formulations in the 1980s, 90s, etc. This, in a way, comes at the tail end. Because, as the encyclical says specifically, so that it was envisaged that this will remain a contentious zone, and therefore there was this particular intervention through this encyclical. The concern is not only with any idea of the truth, etc., but also with what we can refer to as the human condition. In other words, how is this way of thinking, the relation between faith and reason, how is this way of thinking of no such thing as truth, right, of sidelining any kind of discourse about truth affecting the human condition. And this is clearly one of the concerns that comes out. So in a way, at least as far as I can read it from the appeal that is made to philosophy as a discipline more broadly, is one which emphasizes the importance of practical philosophy. In other words, to see the practical implications of the philosophical climate discussions that was taking place at that time. There's one other thing which was mentioned, this tying with a tradition that is broader than the Christian tradition. The choice to start off with the Delphic oracle might seem as an almost obvious one, right? But it's also a challenging one, because the oracles, like the Sibyls and all other forms of what we refer to as the Prisca Sapientia or the Prisca Philosophia, or some want to say the Prisca Theologia, this ancient wisdom, right, that's reached us through fragments that was then rediscovered especially in the 1500s and 1600s, always had this trust to it that there was some way in which, right, truth was accessible to human beings as human beings, and this was before, so the pre-Christian roots of it, etc. So there's also this sense, at least in some parts of the encyclical, that this journey, this truth-seeking journey, is a journey that is common to all of humankind. Of course, the text is addressed mainly to the bishops, right? Which is interesting in itself, but it's not much broader than that. I think this is also an interesting point. Perhaps looking beyond a bit the trigger for the discussion, and just to start off the conversation more than anything else, I think it is very important to make some necessary distinctions, right? When we're speaking about faith and reason, we're not speaking about, they're not an alternative way of referring to philosophy and theology as disciplines, right? It's not necessarily a dichotomy we're talking about, right? And this is important it's an important point to be made, I think, because very often when the question of faith and reason, right, comes up, the conversation, whether it's within a religious context, whether it is within a non-religious context, automatically looks primarily at or assumes almost that there is some kind of mutual exclusivity or else some kind of subordination, right? And I think that one of the things that explicitly comes out in the encyclical is that it wants to avoid, or it suggests avoiding, what it terms as a kind of fideism, right? Which, in other words, rejects any kind of reliance on reason, right? Or which sees reason as complete, as dispensable, and if there is any kind of conflict with it, then just follow fate and forget about reason. That is one approach which has a history of its own, which is best avoided. On the other hand, it's a kind of rationalism, right, which is reductive. In other words, which assumes that everything must necessarily have a rational explanation to it. Now, it is easy to think immediately that the moment you criticize this kind of rationalism, what you're doing is you're opening the path, right, for saying, okay, so human reason has its limits, therefore fate has to compensate. It's not even that the case immediately, so I wouldn't make that jump immediately, right? There are ways in which, or there are different areas, different questions that are not necessarily reducible to evidence, facts, etc. Okay, so when we speak about the truth, when we speak about beauty, so many other things, right? So this kind of rationalism that comes in different forms, in the form of nihilism and a kind of sometimes scientific reductionism, this is something which I think one should be wary about. Okay, and I say so even especially when doing philosophy. So these distinctions are important. Now, faith, as you know, has been described and defined in different ways. And perhaps when we're speaking about faith and reason, part of the conversation, or I think we should invest quite a lot of energy in unpacking what we mean by faith and what we mean by reason before trying to even bring them closer to each other. This is not something which, at least, it's not my intention to unpack completely here. Okay, but it's good to know, right, and to keep in mind in this kind of conversation, I think, that faith means different things, right? Has different meanings. Faith is a theological virtue, right? Faith is a form of thinking, right? Reason means what? Can mean what? So many different things, right? Reason as a human faculty, right? Reasoning as a mental state, reason as order, right? By some account, or in some cases, the Latin ratio, reason, is the Greek logos, and there you have some interesting parts that can be explored there as well. So I think it's important to start off with these distinctions, not so much to make the distinctions, but to be aware that when we're speaking about faith and reason, we're speaking about many different possible meanings of the two terms we are using. Let me stop here for the time being, but
Yes, this last point you made is extremely important, being aware that we should avoid a univocal approach to reason and the faith. These are very elastic concepts and they have many applications. Even Aristotle and Plato themselves knew that reason can be theoretical, practical, logical, metaphysical, ethical, and so reason itself is an ocean of concepts and it affords a wide variety of applications. So we should be wary of, as Professor said, of dogmatic or blind or rash applications of these terms. And same applies to faith. Faith ultimately is an intellectual choice. It's an epistemological commitment to something, to believe somebody, to trust somebody, or if I ask you, well, is he here? I believe so. It's also an act of faith based on the evidence. So the question ultimately is whether by faith we mean something which lacks evidence, something which is based on evidence but still needs some trust. Think of the resurrection of Christ, for instance. Is there evidence for the risen Christ? Well, yes, we do have evidence, but that's based on testimony of others. So it's a kind of faith, it's a kind of evidentialist faith, it's not blind faith. But I think the Catholic tradition has always resisted the view that faith and reason are incompatible or inimical. On the contrary, faith is an exquisite act of the intellect. It's an exquisite act of the intellect and the will, which are the primary human faculties for Aristotle. Fides et ratio, going back to the encyclical, but even beyond it, reminds us of the dangers of being hijacked by perhaps the Enlightenment project. John Paul II is more a son of Kantian philosophy than he would admit. And the Enlightenment project, in Kant's own words, was the boldness of reason, the liberation of reason, or the emergence of reason from its self-incurred minority. To use Kant's own words in his essay, what is the Enlightenment? Is the emergence of human reason from its self-incurred minority, by which he means is a liberation of the human intellect, the human mind, from other authorities, from other institutions, by which he meant revelation and church and the supernatural impact of grace. So in its very inception, the Enlightenment project, the Aufklärung, was seen as a liberation from the supernatural world as a reliable source of knowledge and of truths and of evidence, which is a limiting reductivist factor, as we just heard. So the encyclical, but also within our Christian tradition, we want to be aware of the climate which we inhabit, and which has also influenced the theologians and philosophers in the way they conduct their research and the way they make their claims and assertions, and ultimately it conditions in a very radical way the conception of truth, because truth is what was one of the more contentious themes in philosophy per se. One deficiency of the encyclical, if I may say so, is ignoring the efforts of Catholic philosophers like MacIntyre, Charles Taylor, John Haldane, and others, Fergus Kerr, in engaging with very acrimonious debates and within the analytical world, with naturalistic philosophers like Quine, like Dummett, like Bertrand Russell, and these philosophers have been very humbly and courageously resisting the acidic, so to speak, impact of a naturalist, empiricist approach of these philosophers, which rule out a priori the impact of metaphysics ultimately and of supernatural grace. One leitmotif of the encyclical, but even of our contemporary philosophical debates, is the role of metaphysics in these debates. Do we still need metaphysics or not? And John Paul II says, we need to reclaim metaphysics. We need to give more importance to the philosophy of being, of what he says, the actus essendi, the act of being, what truly gives identity and permanence to individuals as opposed to a very flimsy, flexible, transient, and unnameable, if you like, reality. And we live in that kind of world where using quantum physics as an excuse for skeptical approach to the truth, as an excuse for rampant subjectivism, just because we have, quantum mechanics, quantum physics, and therefore everything is very unpredictable, therefore we cannot know any truth. That's a dogmatic assertion. We should be very, very cautious with that. And that's something which perhaps was left out in the encyclical because it wasn't perhaps seen as important within a papal document, but which we as philosophers, as theologians, we should always keep in mind. And this has influenced Christology, it has influenced fundamental theology, it has influenced theology of grace, biblical studies as well, and even the very notions of subjectivity and objectivity, and the notions of truth, ultimately, which we need to revisit once again. Is knowing truth a possibility at all or not? And what do we mean by that? And some philosophers have, like Aquinas, have said, yes, truth is a coherence or a correspondence between our mind and reality. Sounds naive, and it is. It's an a posteriori, as I said, realism. It depends on the facts and seeing them as they are, as facts. Kant would say, no, we don't have access into the world, we just know what our mind tells us about the world. So there's no real contact with the world, with the reality. We only have contact with our own mind. So we are, helplessly and hopelessly paralyzed by our psychological categories, so to speak. I think Aquinas and John Paul II and other realist philosophers would like to go beyond that and to trust the scientific data, to trust the scientific input we have about nature, about evolution, about the world, about the laws of nature, keeping also in mind the contribution of human constructs and human language throughout. Like we don't have access into an absolute truth through nature alone. And ultimately, for Christians, absolute truth would only be the person of Christ and nothing else. I don't know whether this makes sense, but faith and reason needs to be seen within this light as both complementary but also both autonomous, because they have different principles. So philosophy has its own principles, which are what? Well, logic, reason, its own methodology, its own critique, but even that is open to wide debate. And faith is perhaps less controversial, because faith is an upfront admission towards grace as a source of truth. God is a self-revelatory being, and he shares with us his identity, his life. So faith, so to speak, is much, much less controversial than reason, than philosophy. And there is much less agreement in philosophy about the nature of philosophy than there is in Christian theology, for instance, which opens its mind, its heart to God as showing himself to creation, to nature, and to man ultimately. And if we agree with both Aquinas and with Rana, we have this innate propensity to be summoned and to be invited by our Creator into a conversation, ultimately. So faith and reason are both complementary platforms which enable us to know ourselves better, but also to see ourselves better within a theological framework as well. Something which naturalistic philosophy does not allow. It does not make space for that. Naturalistic philosophy rules that out a priori, dogmatically, so to speak. It disqualifies the possibility of a supernatural being existing and even communicating himself to creation.
No. I'm just not sure whether there's more disagreement in philosophy than there's in theology. Is the fact that there's perhaps less authority, perhaps, but it's probably also because I think as disciplines, right? There are clear differences between philosophy and theology, which, and I don't mean in any competitive sense, but differences in at least two ways. The first one is obviously that in philosophy there are no prior assumptions, right, that are made. Now, of course, there are. As Father Chris said, there are assumptions that are made, on different sides of different debates very often. But that is, for philosophy, that is, at least I find it problematic, right? Making assumptions beforehand, because that pretty much excludes, right, possibilities of certain investigations. On the other hand, theology, in theology there are some basic assumptions, and it is in the sense I take it, right, that it is less controversial. Of course, within both fields there are debates of a meta kind of thing, meta-philosophy. In other words, philosophers discussing what philosophy is, just as, or what it should be, just as you have theologians discussing what theology should be and what it should do, as the recent document by Pope Francis clearly shows. But there's also another thing which is not problematic in itself, but which perhaps is let's say, complicate or makes things a bit more complex rather than complicates them. And that is that whereas theology is and has always been taken as a discipline, right, as a science, as a scientia, philosophy, if you want to go into the meta-philosophy of what philosophy is, etc., things are not as clear-cut, because philosophy is at once a discipline which, as he said, has its methods, and there are varieties of methods, of approaches. The analytic philosophers, for example, tend to discard completely the history of philosophy, whereas one could see, and I would subscribe to this, that doing the history of philosophy is a way of doing philosophy in itself. So this kind of thing. But also, philosophy has always been seen, by Socrates himself, if you want to take one of the usual suspects. But ever since, philosophy has also been seen as a way of life as well, right? And there, for that is where does faith come into the practice of philosophy as a way of life, right? Of course, some philosophers said yes, and there's a compatibility. And others exclude that possibility. But the interesting thing is that philosophy provides a space of conversation between believers and non-believers, and I think that is a privileged place of philosophy, which when I was reading the encyclical in preparation for today, I was happily surprised to see that it is explicitly acknowledged, right? That philosophy is sometimes, I know there are some seminaries, like sometimes I half jokingly tell seminarian students, sort of, I can tell, right? Those who would be good priests from those who would be perhaps better priests, depending on how seriously they take philosophy. But what I mean is, I say it half jokingly, right? But what I mean is that there is a point, right, where conversations cannot take place on the basis of assumptions, right? That it is an act of charity, right, an act of love very often, to start conversations on at a point, right, where we meet, rather than where we are at opposite ends. And in a way, philosophy, as Father Chris mentioned, the whole list of great philosophers, Taylor, MacIntyre, John Haldane, and John Cottingham, many others, are all very careful, extremely careful, right? When writing as philosophers, of course, some of them as philosophers I was going to say philosophers who believe. I mean, all philosophers believe in something, but who hold religious beliefs, right, are always very careful to emphasize this conversational dimension of any kind of discussion involving faith and reason. Okay, precisely for this reason, because if one starts from the point of view that reason has limitations and therefore faith has to come in. Now, one might argue for that. Fine. Right? But that is automatically a kind of exclusivism that says, okay, so first everyone has to come to this point and then we can have real conversations. That is very often not helpful. What I find to be helpful is something which, if I understood correctly, you hinted at, but a particular understanding of faith that has a very long tradition, which has often been forgotten, right? Within theology, within philosophy, etc., and that is the idea of faith as thinking with assent, right? Right, in Augustine, which is developed in Aquinas and others, this cogitare cum assensu, this thinking with assent, which is basically acceptance that involves the will, right, of an idea to be true, but that is characterized especially by this openness to questioning. Right, this openness to questioning. When he said that faith is an intellectual activity, I took it to mean in this way, because it's an intellectual activity, right? And one has to be very wary of the kind of approaches to, not so much to faith, I won't go into that because it's really not my area, but to proclamations, especially of faith, right? That discard completely any kind of intellectual assent, right? That is, in other words, because there it's very, very easy to slip into superstition, fideism, etc., etc. So there one has to be, I think, very careful. But the idea of faith as thinking with assent is one that is characterized fundamentally by this opening to questioning. You mentioned Kant. Kant has this beautiful example, image he uses of the island of truth. He says it's all fine while we're in the island of truth. The moment you start swimming outside, there's a risk of being lost, and there's a risk of, which I think is a beautiful image, but it's also very true, right? Because there are areas. Right, there are discussions, there are conversations where there is this risk of being lost in the sense of, right, I'm not speaking of losing your soul or anything of the sort, but this of being disoriented, okay? And again, back to Augustine and all others, it's nothing new, right? Nothing new under the sun. I mean, faith involves doubt, etc. And sometimes we tend in conversations to forget, right, this wisdom that we find in the system. When I say we, I mean everyone, right? So whether one is a believer or non-believer, and in most of these discussions, very often between very often the louder voices, right, tend to dominate a bit too much these kind of conversations. And what I find very often is that across the board they tend to forget and make too many assumptions. Let's put it this way. Right, about each other's positions, whereas recovering this tradition of this openness to questioning, in other words, assenting towards further thinking, right, assenting towards further thinking in the knowledge that one of the things that entices thought is the sense of mystery. In general, I much prefer speaking about mystery rather than truth, mainly for this reason, right? Because truth is a big word, and this is not a denial of truth, but it's a big word, right? And sometimes it can displace. One need not deny truth to say that to speak of mystery, and very often mystery is what pushes us to inquire further, to think further about things, and this is something which, again, whether speaking of faith, whether speaking of reason, right? This, I use the word carefully, fascination, right? With mystery, is something that very often has been put aside. Again, by different approaches, by different attitudes. The idea of mystery is put aside when one takes a very dogmatic approach and saying this is the truth and the whole truth and nothing but and so subscribe to this, and then we start the discussion here. That is killing that sense of mystery. On the other hand, you can also have someone who would typically be on the opposite side of these debates, who would say, no, there's no such thing as a mystery because everything can be known, right? The kind of reductionist thinking that we're speaking about before. This doesn't lead to anything particularly new, according to me, or anything helpful. So this idea of, which we find in Socrates, which we find in contemporary philosophers like Heidegger and others, this idea of dwelling in questioning, right? To dwell in questioning, right? The word questioning itself involves, right, to question, right, which we associate with doubt. At the same time, it is also a questioning in order to get closer to seek the truth, right? It is this kind of journeying. And I think that very often, when discussing faith and reason, etc., this is why it's important not to start off whether they're dichotomous, whether they're coming together or not, etc., but to see that what is common, right? And it's a common word as well that is used, right? Sometimes it's overused perhaps as a cliché, but I think it's extremely meaningful. In literature, in philosophy, in theology, in the idea of journeying, right? From what I understand, it's also used in a more ecclesiological sense with the whole synodal process, etc., right? The idea of journeying. Again, sometimes it's overused, and sometimes when we overuse terms, we tend to minimize their importance. But this idea of journeying, this journey of questioning, right, is where there are people of different understandings, different faiths of faith, no faith, etc. That is where the meeting points, the points of encounter are very often found. I think, at least.
One comment in reaction and response to what we have just heard, the professor, was sometimes we overlook that philosophy had more than one starting point. we tend to dwell on the introspective starting point, know yourself, the existential, subjective pathway into wisdom. The unexamined life is not worth living. We also forget that it was the paradox of change which aligns very closely the birth of philosophy with the birth of science, and with a negative indictment, because we have the dominance of materialism in this endeavor, in this exercise, because all the first philosophers who engaged, or the first pre-Socratics, the first pre-Socratics who engaged with the question were all materialists, whether it's the atomists, of course, evidently, but also Empedocles. They all want to find an answer about identity and change in terms of matter exclusively. And that is very much with us today, because we have to admit that one of the most dominant, unclaimed, but hugely influential philosophical commitments within the scientific world is a commitment to naturalism and to a materialistic reductionism. So one of the primary roles of philosophy is to uncover the unclaimed bias which neuroscientists, geneticists, cosmologists have. That is a very very current, very urgent mission, so to speak, or vocation, which philosophers need to contribute to, and in my view, they cannot do this without metaphysics. So it's important. It's important to keep in mind, at least with metaphysical sensitivity, Heindebeck. It's important to keep in mind these dual genetic moments of philosophy. One was a primarily subjective, introspective, contemplative approach to philosophy. Gnosis auton, know yourself, the unexamined life is not worth living. The other was more manifestly scientific. And the first philosophers were also the first scientists, and vice versa. Another important theme, which just mentioning it without offering solutions, is the issue of truth and the issue of double truth. In the Middle Ages, we had this theory with Averroes, with Albertus Manius. There are two kinds of truth available to us. One is in conformity with reason, with nature, and with science. The other, which may or may not conform with it, is a supernatural truth. It's called, famously, theory of double truth, something which Aquinas rejects completely. He says, no, there is no double truth. There is one truth, which is, of course, analogically discoverable, but it's one truth which harmonizes everything. That is one of the more challenging issues, I think, which, now going to philosophy and theology, okay? So going beyond the faith and reason continuum, but to a more specialized, so to speak, professional engagement between these two sciences, to use your term, scientia, philosophy and theology, needs to be tackled, I think. The notion of double truth. Should we resign ourselves to the bubble of natural scientific truths, cordoned off from another distant universe of truths, which we call theological truths? Are they connected? Are they in a coextensive spectrum, or are they incompatible? That is one of the more challenging languages which we need to engage with in this context, using the same continuum of faith and reason without being sucked into a dichotomous, as you said, analysis of faith and reason. But nonetheless, we have to respect the autonomy of philosophy and of theology, because they have different starting points. And this is one of the major contributions of Fides et Ratio. It is most, I would define it as an exercise in fundamental theology, because fundamental theology is about the logical interrelationship between philosophy and theology, the role of philosophy within theology. I have to say, this is, in my view, the encyclical is not an exercise in philosophy at all. It is an exercise primarily in fundamental theology. It needs to locate and to clarify the sapiential and logical role of philosophy within theology. It isn't a defense of any philosophy, which is why John Paul II says we're not here to canonize a philosophical system, not because he does not prefer Aquinas, he does, but he doesn't want to do what Aeterni Patris did years before, the encyclical canonizing Thomism and Aquinas, or Pius X or Pius XII in the Humani Generis. He's saying, no, philosophy per se whether it's of the Socratic kind or the Kantian kind or the Heideggerian kind, needs to contribute to the sapiential and logical dimension of theology, without which it would be extremely impoverished. So theology needs philosophy. For the sapiential questions, they are perennial, they are always with us, they always have been and always will be with us. And the logical contribution. Philosophy organizes a systematic relationship between all the claims of the faith. That is crucial, and it's very missing in our world today. Even in the context of the church, of our communities, of theologians and of believers, the logical interrelatedness and sometimes subordination of claims, like a hierarchy of truths. That is the mission of, it's an exquisite mission of philosophy within theology. So those two aspects, keeping in mind the dual starting point of philosophy, I think they are equally important, both the subjective, introspective, contemplative, birth of philosophy, which is gnothesi auton, which the encyclical chooses. But the other, in my view, is more exciting and more relevant, which is the dual birth of philosophy and science, and the dangerous balance towards materialism. And the second is being aware of this potential conflict of truths and how to identify, how to offer a taxonomy of truths, which is, in my view, extremely important. I rest my case for now. Perhaps we have some questions.
Yes.
You probably can be.
My voice is loud enough. Well, you know, all the booming distracts people. I was always very, very pleased on hearing your responses to, well, this relationship of faith and reason that I accept. And then it's been sort of promulgated, etc. now. Not promulgated, rather, just exposed and spoken about. But I've never really heard a counterpoint on your side, something that said, right, you know, when it's speaking about truths and that sort of thing, well, it said there is a truth, you know, capital T, R, and UTH, and that sort of thing. So, and the other point I want to make is that philosophers can't get away from the fact that human beings, as they are, do have something in them, whether they recognize it or not.
They don't.
That is always right. Well, they do, and that's a truth, capital T. Something within them, called the soul, that in fact seeks the truth. So, accept it or not accept it, it's there. It's beyond my control, yours, and anyone else's. And this is, so in fact, where philosophy goes into an area, it does happen, sort of waves of really just going round the maze and going around the maze and going around the maze and going around the maze. Oh, we were at this corner before. And then it comes into another phase where they want to go towards something or other. You know, take materialism as a major thing or not. So I was very keen on hearing your responses, your counterpoint, you might say. It hasn't even been directly opposite, but something which, in fact, when you mention there's such thing as a truth, the truth, because there are, then I haven't heard the reason or any sort of thing as to say why you say that. And just one example, okay.
You know, I'm not sure I got the question right? Because a counterpoint to what?
To the system drawn up, you can say it, the encyclical said, Fides et Ratio, but that's coming also from a long history before that, as to make this relationship between faith and reason. The Enlightenment wanted to say there's such thing as faith anyway, you know, there's such a thing, it's all reason, and then they found out they came to a crashing halt, and now we are in the age of unreason now, actually, so we're post-Enlightenment. I haven't heard your counterpoint to Fides et Ratio put out so very well and also now explained this evening.
Okay, my counterpoint to Fides et Ratio. To there being a relation.
The relationship, faith and reason.
Okay, all right, so let me try and explain it in different ways. I would say that believing and knowing are two distinct, exclusive mental states, right? So believing and believing and knowing, two different mental faculties that play distinct roles, that they can be complementary, but they are two different ways of thinking with assent. So when I said that faith is thinking with assent, knowledge is also thinking with assent. There are two ways, right, of doing so differently that can be complementary. So that is, what I tried saying when there's no counterpoint I want to make to fides et ratio, because there's no one point fides et ratio is making, right?
Now I must have missed the head. I think it does. It explains an explanation. It gives a relationship between the two. But anyway.
Perhaps what you're alluding to is that there are truths and there is the truth. And so to admit there is a transcendence of truth found in the person of Christ, but that's through revelation. So faith is making space for a God who reveals himself. No, faith is the willingness or the openness which humanity has towards God. Or not, to say no. We want to exclude God systematically. We don't do God, as Tony Blair once said. Sorry?
It wouldn't be classified as a thinking exercise. It's another part of it.
Yeah, it's part of the intellect. No, God doesn't want to shun our intellectual capacities. He gave us our intellect for us to seek him and for us to tune into his revelation, so to speak. So he calls us and we hear him and we listen to him and we say yes or we say no. And we could not do that without our intellectual capacities. No? So our intelligence is a God-given aspect of nature for us to connect to a supernatural possibility called revelation, called grace.
Thinking philosophy would be...
Now, philosophy...
Purely thinking exercises are going around.
Yes. As it has evolved, philosophy needs to be naked, so to speak. It cannot enjoy the comfort of revelation or of scripture as a starting point. It can engage with it, but its starting point has to be a question. Like, who am I? What am I? What am I for? What is the truth? Is the truth? Or what is good? What is wrong? And am I free? So usually philosophy, as we understand it now, is a set of questions. You could say that Christianity is a set of answers to the questions. But we also want to give the benefit of philosophy within theology, as I said, to nourish the sapiential and the logical needs of theology then as an academic discipline, or of the faith as an organized system of beliefs.
Well, I do not think that that philosophy is sort of a kind of useless maze, right?
I didn't say useless maze, it's a very round maze.
Yeah, okay.
The same corner again.
No, it doesn't.
No. Is it in a direction?
No, it doesn't have.
There are phases, I said. That phase,
yes.
There are some phases where it does.
Yes, if you look at Plato, there's a very clear understanding of a transcendental, right? So I wouldn't be too quick to dismiss neither philosophy as a discipline, but that might sound a bit cheap because of, I wouldn't be doing this had I thought that it was so useless. But also because you have these kind of, as you call them, waves, right, in thinking, which you find across the different disciplines, right? Just to mention one example, taking from what Father Chris and was saying before. The Enlightenment, and here I speak as a historian of philosophy, right? The Enlightenment and the 19th century historiography, including the historiography of philosophy like Bertrand Russell and all others, presented a very monolithic understanding of science that is purified not only of religion, which is, but of any kind of, anything that is they consider to be remotely superstitious, etc., etc. Now, because these questions are addressed not in some kind of apologetic way, but through proper research, right, through proper historical research, etc., that claim of the Enlightenment, which has had a huge impact, right? Because sound bites usually sell and all that, is being undone through proper research. So, for example, take someone like Newton, right? And so many others, so many of the founders of, so-called founders of early modern science, etc. I was just at this, there's this project at the University of the Belgian University, I was at a workshop last month, dealing with specifically this question. The use and the references that Newton and others made to this prisca sapientia, right? To this sapiential knowledge of antiquity from the what do you call them? From the oracles and the different kind of oracles, right? The Oracle of Delphi was one of them, perhaps the most famous one, and others, and that there was this persistence, and this persistence remained, right, of different kind of knowledges, including those sources of knowledge that were not purely scientific, mathematical, etc., that contributed to the foundations of modern science, etc. So, which is far removed from the idea that the Enlightenment 19th century historiography has presented, and which in a way we're still battling with, right? That there was some kind of complete break with the emergence of modern science. There very clearly wasn't, and I say this not as a not as some kind of opinion, or because I'm interested in recovering something that was lost, but as a pure historical fact. So in this sense, one has to take a very humanist approach, right? By humanists I mean the Renaissance humanists. Ite ad fontes, go to the sources, go to the texts. And what you find in the text is precisely that there wasn't this kind of great break between science and everything else that came before it, and yet we still hear of Galileo and all the cases, right? But I think we have to be careful when we speak of belief and knowledge, right? To think of them as two different faculties. I don't know what Chris thinks of this, but this is very important, because very often, right, most of the more heated debates, I think, and are the result very often of confusion, right, of these kind of terms. And if there's perhaps one thing that philosophy can help doing, even though very often philosophers mess it up, of course, is to bring that kind of clarity and make the necessary distinctions when they are necessary, because that is something where, if we're speaking of the importance of logic, that distinctions in logic, as you know, are fundamental. To logic, I will also add logic and the logical and the dialogical, right? In other words, the importance of being able to dialogue, which should never be, either underrated or overrated, right? Because this is very often difficult, and this is then a broader, right, social malaise, if you like, the inability or the difficulty we find in entering into any kind of dialogue, and this is one of them. Right, and this is one of, because very often, the problems we face when discussing something like faith and reason is not too different, right? The subject matter is of course different, but the more formal, the content is very similar to the problems we face in any kind of dialogical exercise, right? I think everyone can ask it.
First of all, thank you very much for this wonderful talk. It's been very informative and a very engaging conversation to hear between you two. But my question is, from a historical standpoint, we are constantly seeing periods of, let's just say, hyper kind of logic, scientific periods, like, or let's say the Renaissance, where you can see this aim for perfection, this aim for intense knowledge, being followed by intense periods of faith and more targeting towards the emotional. So let's say the Baroque, which followed the Renaissance. In response to your can this be an example that there is in fact a truth that we're all seeking ultimately, that is not that extreme logic and extreme science does not necessarily satisfy, that there is something beyond us that is emotional, that is beyond rationality, that we're still seeking from this historical fact of this kind of cyclical extreme reason being followed by intense periods of faith?
I'm not sure how to answer that. It depends whether you want us to answer as philosophers or theologians.
It's easier for me because I'm not a theologian, so...
I'll answer it as a story.
Let me just premise that I don't think that things are necessarily so clear-cut in terms of movements, right? Of course, Burckhardt and the history of art, the Renaissance and the Baroque had very clear definitions, which I think more recent scholarship has more or less blurred. But what is, I think is true is that there's always there are two kinds of yearnings, right? I would call it extreme science, right? But I wouldn't call it that way. But I understand what you're referring to clearly. But there's this yearning for knowledge, and like any new discoveries, I mean, I would call it discoveries, but the discovery of the new world, just as the discoveries of the new planetary movements and all that in the 1500s, 1600s, brought about a change and caused a great deal of questioning. Now, of course, when you're questioning, right, going back to that phrase I used from Kant, first of all, you don't have all the answers at once. So trying to make sense, to give meaning of things, right, to realities, to new realities, is something that is clearly not easy, right, but that requires time, patience, observation, study, contemplation, and all of that. So any kind of, and we're experiencing this today, perhaps even more, because the speed is more, okay? That trying to make sense of the things. Now, I would say that sort of excluding, just relying simply on science, for example, at the exclusion of anything else, can also be one form of saying, okay, we'll just move ahead and leave everything else aside. But of course, together with this yearning for knowledge, of scientific knowledge, I think that there has always been, and I think we can observe this even historically if we had to go deeper into it, right? There's always the yearning for knowledge and the yearning for meaning. And they're not the same thing. Right? Of course, there will be times, but this happens at an individual level, let alone at a broader level. There will be times where these two kind of yearnings collide, make it more difficult for each other to grasp, etc. So rather than seeing necessarily as a kind of a teleological historical process, right? I would see this as really a reflection of the human condition across time, right? That new things, new knowledge, this yearning to know more, but this yearning to be able to do more. Now, of course, there were times in history, and there are times where these conflicts between it, to this sense that give rise to this kind of sense of disorientation, right, led different people to make all sorts of, let's call them mistakes, right? Of either of rashness or of holding back or of closing off to one kind of yearning or to mix things up, etc. But I think that seeing this process which you mentioned as more of a continuum, at least I find in trying to understand, I find it a bit more helpful. So it wasn't a reply, but
just to complement what you said, these two yearnings, you could give them a name. So for knowledge and for meaning, to qualify them. So one is synchronic and one is diachronic, because the quest for meaning is a journey which every individual has to engage with qua individual. Whereas that for knowledge is incremental. It depends on the wisdom of others. So now we don't go back to, Euclidean geometry as the absolute final word, because we have other models of mathematics, etc. So we do learn, there is a Darwinian progress, if you like, even in science, so to speak, that there are models which survive and others which fall on the side because they are less productive, less effective, and less successful. That's something like we acquire knowledge and we build on it, whether it's in neuroscience, in cosmology, in medicine, in genetics, whereas the meaning question is an existential problem which we have as individuals. It always starts from scratch. You have a 10-year-old child who's engaging with the meaning of his life, who is suicidal, who is depressed. It's completely autonomous from the other journey, from the other yearning for knowledge, I think. So, as I agree with you, there are two structural yearnings we have, two structural or genetic, possibly, thirsts for truth. One comes through a thirst for knowledge, through science, research, experiment, discovery, and narrative. The other through one's own engagement with existential questions, with meaning, with one's personal meaning.
You might keep it short because we're actually running out of time, but you can actually try. Okay.
No, they won't. First of all, thank you very much. It enlightened me a lot. I cannot imagine my faith without philosophy. I spent 5 years studying philosophy, and it deepened my faith. I mean, with all the roundabouts and everything, but you have to go there before you know what is real and what is not. And more than the concept of truth, I think we have missed something that C.S. Lewis had emphasized a lot of, and it's the concept of justice. Man seeks justice. Justice, I mean, I will give an example. Hitler killed millions of Jews, then he just blew his head, and he got away with it. If there wasn't an ultimate justice, and I think most people would agree that it's not fair, it's not right. If there was not an ultimate justice, that concept would, we couldn't come to terms with it. And man, however bad he is, there's this concept of justice, which I think will balance faith a bit more over reason. But they are both important, because you cannot have laws if you do not have reason. The thing is, did I make myself clear? The concept of justice has been left out. We're always talking about the concept of truth. But I think what man really seeks is justice. And it is all around us. It is in every country. It's in every society. We want justice. And I don't think that justice can be found if there was nothing above us. Ultimate justice. Maybe I'm out of point.
No, not at all. But I'm just saying signs at the back that we're running out of time. No, I agree.
That philosophy is very important.
I won't go into this discussion of because philosophy. But no. I mean, I agree with you, and I also think that it's important for any faith journey to that. But what is interesting in what you said is, we're speaking about justice with a capital J, truth with a capital T. I mean, we've had to turn Platonic, right? We're speaking about the same, we're the same. But it's interesting that you made this point, and I'll just make this very quick reflection. Is that just as in philosophy or in anything else, there are different attitudes, different approaches. That is, we enter, right, the labyrinth of life in so many different ways, right? It's the same thing in the history of theology, but it's also the same faith journey. That's why I really wanted to stress the idea of journeying, right, and of questioning, because there are journeys that lead to this kind of thing, right? That it's true justice that then opens up much of the rest. For others, it is through the idea of truth. But this is the history of philosophy. different philosophers started from different points, but then it becomes incremental. And this is where, in a way, our own individual, micro history somehow at some point interacts with, the broader.
I'll try to conclude as quickly as possible. I just want to make a few points which I think strike me quite a lot with regards to what has been said. One point which struck me was the emphasis that was made upon this personal journeying with regards to our desire for truth. Because if we think about, as Professor De Lucca outlined, we are fascinated by mystery. But at the same time, we are also afraid when we're out there. We're also afraid of not knowing, and we're also afraid of the journey of. We don't like not knowing. We want to know, but at the same time, we don't like not knowing. So when we speak of extremes, when we speak of fideism, when we speak of rationalism, when we speak of when we're reductive, when we're being reductive as human beings, I think it's good to be aware that it says a lot about ourselves. It's actually a reflection of what's going on in us, right? Is there this fear of not knowing, but at the same time there's this fear of knowing. So that's one point I wanted to emphasize with regards to this relationship. Another thing that struck me was philosophy. It creating a space for the dialogue. So in a sense, it's privileged. But apart from it creating a space for this dialogue, it's also able, in a sense, the truths of faith. Philosophy can, rather than explaining them, it can explore them. This is something that has been hinted at. But I think this is where philosophy comes in. It explores certain claims of faith or certain truths of faith. And I'll conclude on this. Another point which I think was alluded to, but I want to elaborate it a bit further, is, yes, we do question as human beings, and it comes quite natural to us. When we do so, in our act of questioning, in our simple act of questioning, we are in itself committing acts of faith. Because when you question, you are assuming, in some sense, somehow, that you can discover something. But you have no clear evidence of that. But you're in the question itself, you're assuming that you can somewhat discover. There's an act of faith there. So at the conception of a question, there is literally a marriage between faith and reason. Now, apart from that, I just want to ask whether, to continue this journey, to further on this journey, whether there are any books that these two thinkers would suggest, or any few books that we can look to in order to continue our journeying and exploration, so to speak. Yes, please.
Actually, all right, yes. Two suggestions. One is a book by John Cottingham, who I mentioned before, John Cottingham, Why Believe? John Cottingham is a British philosopher, one of the great scholars on Descartes. Okay, but he's also made important contributions to in a more accessible way to this kind of questions. The second one is a book that will be out next month, which deals with one of the things I spoke about today, thinking with assent. It's the recovery of a tradition. It was written by Rosa Antoniazza, Maria Rosa Antoniazza, who was for some years head of philosophy at King's College, who passed away quite suddenly last year. She is a great historian of philosophy and the authority on Leibniz, and this is her final work. She was working on it right till the last days before she passed away. I was lucky to to see earlier drafts of the text. It will be out next month, and I think it's really her magnum opus, which brings together her lifelong concerns with questions of faith, reason, philosophy, theology, etc., but with an exceptionally strong historical basis to it that challenges many of the assumptions that are usually made in this kind of discussion. So Maria Rosa Antoniazza, Thinking with Assent, coming out next month, and John Cottingham, Why Believe, which is an example of a respectful conversation